In the olden time when wishing was having, there lived a king whose daughters were all beautiful. But the youngest was so very beautiful that the sun himself, although he saw her very often, was pleased every time he looked at her. Near the castle of this king was a large and gloomy forest, in the midst of which stood an old lime tree, beneath whose branches Fatchen splashed in a little fountain. When the day was very hot, the king's youngest daughter would run into the wood and sit down by the fountain, and when she felt dull would often play with a golden ball, throwing it up in the air, catching it as it fell. One day, when the king's daughter threw this golden ball into the air, it fell on the grass and rolled past her into the fountain. She followed the ball with her eyes as it sank into the water, which was so deep that no one could see to the bottom. Then she began to cry. And as she cried, a voice called out, "Why weepest thou, O king's daughter? Thy tears would melt even a stone to pity." She looked around to see whence the voice came, and there was a frog stretching his head out of the water. "Ah, you old water paddler," said she. "Was it you that spoke? I am weeping for my golden ball, which has slipped away from me into the water." "Be quiet and do not cry," said the frog. "Perhaps I can help thee. But what wilt thou give me if I fetch thee thy ball?" "What will you have, dear frog?" said she. "My dresses, my rings and pearls, or the golden crown which I wear?" The frog answered, "Dresses or rings or golden crowns are not for me. But if thou wilt love me, and wilt let me be thy playmate, and sit at thy table, and eat from thy little golden plate, and drink out of thy cup, and sleep in thy little bed, if thou wilt promise me all these, then I will dive down and get thy golden ball." "Oh, I will promise you all those," said she, "if you will only get me my ball." But she thought to herself, "What a silly frog! Let him remain in the water with his equals. He cannot play with me." The frog, as soon as he had her promise, drew his head under the water and dived down. Soon he swam up again with the ball in his mouth, and threw it on the grass. The king's daughter was full of joy when she again saw her beautiful plaything, and taking it up, she ran off. "Stop, stop!" cried the frog. "Take me with thee. I cannot run as thou canst." But all his croaking was useless. Although it was loud enough, the king's daughter did not heed it, but ran home, and soon forgot the poor frog, who was obliged to leap back into the fountain. The next day, when the king's daughter was sitting at table with her father, eating from her own little golden plate, something was heard coming up the marble stairs. Splish, splash, splish, splash. When it came to the top, it knocked at the door, and a voice said, "Open the door, thou youngest daughter of the king." The maiden rose and went to see who it was that called her. When she opened the door and caught sight of the frog, she shut it again and sat down at the table, looking very pale. The king saw that she was in fear of something, and asked her if a giant had come to take her away. "Oh no," answered she, "it is not a giant, but an ugly frog." "What does the frog want of you?" said the king. "Oh, dear father, when I was playing by the fountain, my golden ball fell into the water, and this frog fetched it up again because I cried so much. I must tell you that I promised him he should be my playmate. I never thought that he could come out of the water, but somehow he has jumped out, and now he wants to come in here." At that moment there was another knock, and a voice said, "King's daughter, youngest, open the door. Hast thou forgotten thy promise made at the fountain so clear, 'neath the lime tree's shade? King's daughter, youngest, open the door." Then the king said, "What you have promised, that you must perform. Go and let him in." So the king's daughter opened the door, and the frog hopped into the room, right up to her chair. As soon as she was seated, the frog said, "Take me up." But she waited so long that at last the king said she must obey the frog. As soon as the frog was placed on the chair, he jumped upon the table and said, "Now push thy plate near me, that we may both eat from it." And she did so, but as everyone saw, with very bad grace. The frog seemed to relish his dinner, but every bit that the king's daughter ate nearly choked her. At last the frog said, "I feel very tired. Wilt thou carry me upstairs into thy chamber and make thy bed ready for me to sleep in it?" At this speech the king's daughter began to cry, for she was afraid of the cold frog and dared not touch him. And besides, he wanted to sleep in her own beautiful clean bed. But her tears made the king very angry, and he said, "Never treat with scorn one who has helped you in time of your trouble." So she took the frog up with 2 fingers and put him in a corner of her room. But he hopped up to her and said, "I am so very tired that I shall sleep well. Do let me rest on your pillow." But she threw him against the wall, saying, "Now will you be quiet, you ugly frog?" As he fell, he was changed from a frog into a handsome prince with beautiful eyes, who after a while became, with her father's consent, her dearest friend and playmate. Then he told her how he had been changed to a frog by an evil witch, and that no one but herself had the power to take him out of the fountain, and that now she should share his kingdom. So one day a carriage drawn by 8 white horses with ostrich feathers on their heads and golden bridles drove up to the door of the palace, and behind the carriage stood trusty Henry, the servant of the young prince. When his master was changed into a frog, trusty Henry had grieved so much that he had bound 3 iron bands round his heart for fear it should break with grief and sorrow. When the carriage was ready to carry the young prince to his own country, the faithful Henry helped the princess and the prince into the carriage and placed himself into the seat behind, full of joy at his master's release. They had not gone far when the prince heard a crack as if something had broken behind the carriage. He put his head out the window and asked Henry what had broken, and Henry answered, "It was not the carriage, my master, but a band which I bound round my heart when it was in such grief because you were changed into a frog." Twice afterwards on the journey there was the same noise, and each time the prince thought that it was some part of the carriage that had given way. But it was only the breaking of the bands which bound the heart of the trusty Henry, who was ever after free and happy.